What would happen if you mixed this with this? You've got Mitsugushi's synesthetic masterwork Rez and Miyamoto's economical racer Excitebike. One is a game about music and evolution, sparks, lights, triggered samples and the tension between the merging digital and analogue worlds of the new millennium. One is a game about straight lines and simple angles, the illusion rather than the presentation of a cyclic track, and a desire for the perfection of an almost literal racing line. You've probably heard of Rez. Launching on the Dreamcast in 2001 before being ported to the PlayStation 2, later the Xbox 360, and finally the PlayStation 4 and PC with VR support, it's a rail shooter set to a techno soundtrack. It looks and sounds almost unlike anything else. You've definitely heard of Excitebike. Whether through its release around the launch of the NES in the mid-80s, its sequels and spin-offs on the N64 and beyond, its virtual console reappearance on the Wii, Wii U or 3DS eShops, or even its inclusion as a track in Mario Kart 8's DLC, it's one of the Nintendo franchises which people just know. On this edition of You Might Know This, But You Didn't Know That, we'll look at a series that bridges the otherwise disparate worlds of these two games. You probably don't know Skip Ltd's Bit Generation series on the Game Boy Advance. 7 games released exclusively in Japan, though all with English menus, that were weird. DotStream was one of those games. Probably the most playable, and certainly the most expansive of the catalogue, DotStream is a racing game, and one that I believe was inspired in equal parts by both Rez as well as Excitebike. There's Rez in its aesthetic. Even with the low resolution and hardware limitations of the GBA, DotStream exudes a sort of techno-cool. The soundtrack is incredible, even when heard through the tinny mono speaker of the handheld. The sound effects are obviously far more sparse than the high-fidelity, layered samples of Rez, but they are there, and they're quantized along to the 4-to-the-floor, bass thud and fluttering hi-hats. Hit a speed boost, and with your eyes closed you can almost imagine moving between the layers of one of Rez's iconic stages. It does a lot with a little. But there's also Excitebike in its simple, almost Euclidean design. You control a simple line which accelerates automatically. You shift lanes by moving up and down with the D-pad. If your line overlaps another racing line, you are bullied to one side, but also gain a speed boost, almost as if drafting in a Ridge Racer game. Just like Excitebike, you want to maintain as straight a racing line as possible, with every shift up or down costing you that little bit of speed. Also, like Miyamoto's Racer, tracks are point to point, repeating inexplicably at their end. An implied loop. Just as in Excitebike, hazards are devastating, either draining your speed or destroying your line outright, costing you a life. Similar to F-Zero, another of Miyamoto's creations, your life is also tied to your ability to boost. Crash when your boost meter is at 0 and it's race over. DotStream's rule set is easily communicated, but surprisingly challenging to play. It takes time to understand the weight of your line as you launch it up and down in large arcs to settle into safe lanes or navigate around hazards. The boosting system means there is always a risk versus reward consideration to make. Do you boost ahead early, sacrificing your top speed as you lead the pack? Or do you hold off until the later stages of the game, nestling amongst the group as if horse racing, before pulling ahead in a passage of tricky obstacles using your boost? DotStream is a great game that absolutely nobody played. Not content to languish in the handheld space of the mid-2000s, Skip would raise their profile with Chibi Robo on the GameCube, before transitioning back to relative obscurity with the Art Style series on the Wii and the DS. These console-exclusive, digitally distributed games were very much the next bit generation, presenting either new or reworked game concepts as cheap, low-risk, downloadable titles. Light Tracks is the sequel to DotStream in all but name. The game retains the visual aesthetic of Rez and its neo-futurism, but extends the Game Boy title by moving into the third dimension. Cleverly, the first track you play starts in 2D, almost as a callback to the original game, before quickly turning the play space at an angle to reveal its added depth. Tracks now snake in a slightly more logical loop, up hills, around corners, over physical obstacles, but otherwise the mechanics are much the same as DotStream. Gone is the pit stop system of the original, that had allowed you to stock up on boosts at the expense of your lead, but aside from this small change, you are still dealing largely with the question of how best to maintain your speed amongst a pack of other competing lines. Boosts now regenerate as a result of your drafting, but the speed at which the gauge replenishes means you will largely play Light Tracks as its forebear. As before, it looks and sounds fantastic. There's something about the simplistic visual design that means it just doesn't show its age. This is a standard definition Wii game from 2010 that could have released on a vector-based arcade machine in the early 80s, or last week on the PlayStation 4. Other than the stair-stepping artifacts on the lines as they weave across the screen, this is fresh visual design. Like the Game Boy Advance title, you complete sets of 4 races almost like a traditional Mario Kart Cup. Unlike the races it follows, however, to unlock the next cup you must take the freeway, an into-the-screen supplementary mode that has you building score and speed by drafting and overtaking adjacent lines. This is more of a time trial than a race, but its inclusion spices up the format of the handheld game immeasurably. This travelling momentum feels like Rez's on-rails stages. It's a great addition. Light Tracks is another great game, that again, nobody played. Sadly, because of the Wii Shop's closure in early 2019, the game is now locked to the consoles of those elucidated enough to have grabbed at the time. I will state though, that soft modding a Wii or Wii U is relatively straightforward in 2020, and as ever, if Nintendo aren't interested in preserving their digital legacy, there will always be enterprising hackers working to conduct this active digital preservation for them. Although Skip Ltd have been reasonably quiet since their efforts on the Wii, the DotStream Light Tracks format would have at least one more run out via the Xbox Live indie games title Bitstream. Xbox Live indie games, affectionately abbreviated to XBlig, was a service that allowed home development and publishing on the Xbox 360. Games were peer-reviewed to make sure they functioned as described and didn't have any naughties like big old naked boobies in them. The marketplace itself was an absolute Wild West. Thousands of games were published across its lifespan. Many were good, some were great, lots were absolute tosh. Bitstream sits at the upper end of the spectrum. Following the framework of DotStream very closely, Bitstream has you racing as a coloured line, drafting for speed, navigating hazards, though this time with a lot more bloom, a lot more particle effects, and sadly, quite a lot more slowdown. For an independent effort though, it was a commendable attempt to give the unique joys of Skip series one last airing. Yet again, it's a great game, that in this case, few aside from me played. It's been totally expunged from the web. The developers, from what I can tell, have folded. The game is no longer purchasable after the XBlig marketplace shut down in 2017. The digital future is miserable. So what do you get when you mix Rez with Excitebike? A weird, minimalist racer that across 3 entries caught the eye of almost no one.